Hello, and welcome to the Todd and Taylor Show. I am Todd A, and with me as always is
Taylor Trask.
So, take two on episode 6. We had some technical difficulties, which none of you would know. I didn't really need to confess that. But we are now rolling, and it sounds so much better to my ears. I hope it does to yours too.
Your voice is much more. Your voice is always more warm and inviting than mine. So I have to. You're going to have the. I need to sort of. I sound a little shrill sometimes. And listening back to the old episodes, you're like, "Hey, this is my point," and I'm like, "This is my point," and it just sort of interesting dynamic, interesting contrast.
Well, that's interesting that's what you hear, because of course I hear it back, and I'm just like, "Oh, what am I doing? What is this groaning noise that I'm making?" Taylor's right in the right frequency.
I was just sort of sounding like Alec Baldwin and just talk like this the whole time.
Yeah, we can have a gravelly voice talking episode. So today we are talking about The Martian.
Yes.
And it's funny. I'm having it like I'm having like a brain delay in getting my thoughts together because we started this last night and we got the intro done, and then the technical problems put us off track. Mm-hmm. And so now my brain is like, I think we just talked about this. But
well, let's start kind of as a tail end from our last episode, which was about sci-fi and what is and isn't sci-fi and all that kind of stuff. Because one of the things we didn't do was actually definitively say what some of our favorite sci-fi shows actually were, or not just shows. It could be anything. And I think part of that was just because we were trying to define the question or define the answer to the question. So in doing so, we didn't really, I think both of us are kind of like, well, we don't want to, try to put something in that category if we're still trying to understand the category. But I guess for you, what would be some of your, like, if you can name 3 to 5 things that you consider sci-fi, that, your stamp of approval, what would they be?
Thank you for kicking me back into line. Yes. So part of that discussion was like science fiction versus science fantasy. And, we both came down on, I think we both came down on like, it doesn't really matter. So I will put in there Star Wars, even though I recognize the argument that is science fantasy, but I mean, it's just such a, that's what I think of when I think of science fiction, is like that, those movies from my childhood. So that's a really big one. And then a real recent one, we've talked comic books recently, and I would say Saga.
Interesting.
Yeah, which when we have discussed before, you've raised the contention that too may be fantasy.
And I sort of hinted at this last night too, but I haven't read Saga yet. I just know what I've gleaned from you and from perusing through trade paperbacks in the store. That at just on the surface feels like it's almost pure fantasy, but you say it's you would put it in the sci-fi camp because, well,
I'm applying those dumb or broad rules the same as Star Wars, which is like it happens in space, gotcha. Which is funny that I would get caught. I mean, this whole conversation is funny that I would get caught in that, and but I guess because it concerns aliens and different planets and rocket ships, I think sci-fi. And then another Image comic that we have that I've brought up recently is Black Science, which I think we can pretty securely put in the sci-fi realm.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I think and when people tell me about hard sci-fi, that's usually not that story specifically, but what I kind of glean from Black Science, it definitely fits that comfortably.
Right.
Which is weird though, because there's such a Lovecraftian kind of vibe to it that
that's a good point.
I don't know if, and I would always think of like Lovecraft stuff as more fantasy than sci-fi. So maybe that's where, and at the end of the day, too, keep this in mind, folks. Like at the end of the day, it is whatever genres and these kind of categories are becoming less and less important in the grand scheme of things. But for marketing purposes and for reaching niche audiences, I think that's where the basis of our conversation sort of came from last week. Like, to reach those hardcore folks who really are like, this is sci-fi. Like what is that approach? How are we framing it?
Sure. And as part of that is that where you and I came down last week is neither of us are hardliners. So if someone wanted to contest that was not hard sci-fi or that's more science fantasy or something, I'm just going to kind of shrug and go, yeah, okay, that's great. So I'm not really, I'm not trying to advocate to pigeonhole it in something over another. And then it's not that recent anymore, but I think District 9 just really put me. Like that was just like a big booming signal of like, this is a new way that we're going to look at science fiction. That movie really impacted me a lot. I mean, and probably even though I was really young when I saw the first Alien and Aliens, I really think it was that kind of impact to me,
Wow.
So what about yourself?
Why do you think it was? No, well, let me ask you this though. Why do you think it was so impacting? Was it the visuals? Was it the social commentary? Because it was packed with metaphor. I mean, it's pretty heavily handedly packed with metaphor.
But I think the issue of apartheid and all that, and that it happened in South Africa, and it was. I mean, I loved that context to it for sure. But I think this feeds into my next comment, which I think it was just so. Like, oh man, I almost used the word gritty, but it was so realistic in that, it's like there was at some point there was very little suspension of disbelief you had to do, like it was there, it was shot in this grainy footage often. And it was, it was like, it was just so, it's this word that I love about filmmaking, which is visceral. It was like you were in the action, you were seeing the like, blood and sweat and it was just kind of gross. It was sort of like, it reminded me in a lot of ways of The Fly, which is another kind of gross horror sci-fi. But I don't know. I guess at the time, I'd become a real passive consumer of science fiction, not really thinking about this movie's sci-fi or that movie's, superheroes. It was just sort of like it was mainstream, and District 9, I think, really drew a line and like this is a science fiction movie and
I think too, like one of the things we brought up last week was I think when people define sci-fi, I think that social commentary or that heavy metaphor element is it's not necessarily social commentary, but criticizing or critiquing the conditions in which we currently live.
That's a really good point.
And I think and I'll put on my list right off the top like Dune, because I think Dune. Right. It's held, even though I think there's a lot of fantasy elements in that too, I think it's often held up as a sci-fi masterpiece just because it deals with everything from immigration to heavily commenting on environmental impact and native peoples versus sort of ruling classes, and just all of that kind of stuff gets really, and a lot of it was ahead of its time too. We're only just now starting to kind of really get into the weeds on a lot of the things it addresses. So I definitely would put that there. I would say on the comic book side.
Well, now let me ask you a question about Dune before we proceed, which was just a recap from last week. When you talk about Dune, is it the movie or the miniseries or the books?
Book first and foremost, but the movie I just sort of discount because it was just, I don't feel it really lines up. The movie itself is to the book as the Shining movie is to the Shining book, which is loosely adapted from. Some people might disagree with me. And David Lynch, I think it's David Lynch, is the is the Second Coming, but it's just, I don't know, it didn't really work for me. And strangely enough, the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries that came out in 2000 and then the sequel, which came out in 2003, I feel were much like the Shining miniseries that had Steven Weber from Wings. Like it had more time to tell the story so they could get more deep into it, and you got to glean a lot more for it. But we're really, when we say Dune at this juncture, we're just talking about the book because that's sort of the original. Gotcha. It's as layered as it's ever going to get. Cool. I think too, on the other side, on the comic book side of things, I'm just going to throw in the trade paperback or just the volume Nowhere Men, because that's when we were talking about what is and isn't sci-fi on the last episode, that kept popping in my head. Like, if this isn't sci-fi, I don't know what is. It's got everything. It's got everything heavily talking about how scientists when treated like rock stars can go in one direction, and what sort of the fruits of that labor behold. And there's just a lot of juicy stuff going on in that story, in addition to just a very easy to digest, like superhero origin story for all intents and purposes, because these people, go up on the space station and are impacted by this stuff, and they think it's disease and ailments that are affecting them, realize that they're gaining these powers. So there's that kind of part of it too. But I think just definitely if we're going to call something sci-fi, that's where I would start, is with Nowhere Men.
Well, I like how that sort of loops around in our other interests, and I brought it up in our sci-fi discussion last week about, to me, a lot of superhero stories are science fiction. And, just when you've described Nowhere Men, I'm instantly thinking of like Superman as this great alien story, and, really like a First Contact kind of story. And then and then Fantastic Four, of course, has that sci-fi element as, another group that goes into space, and, cosmic radiation changes their bodies. And so, there's definitely that, to me, that there's a really easy connection between superhero lore and science fiction.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's baffling to me that, I think Fantastic Four has the most of the popular, sort of most well-known stuff. I think Fantastic Four is the most deliberate sort of connection to that, where it's like, oh, this is a sci-fi origin story, and they just happen to be superheroes. I think Nowhere Men sort of takes it no one at any time calls them superheroes. In fact, Volume 1 ends when they've just all escaped the space station. They realize, not all of them, but some of them are realizing that this is not a disease. They're not going to die. In fact, it's the opposite. They're gaining these abilities, and nobody has officially called them superheroes or heroes, or has put them together in a team yet. But you can kind of see that's where this is headed. So that just sort of that slow build is what I really, nobody's running around in a giant robot being stopped by, a flaming guy or anything like that. So it's like, I like that. And I think, Fantastic Four, it's weird that Fantastic Four, they can't figure that out. Like, I think they may have tried earnestly with this new movie to kind of underplay the hero part of it, and make it just more about the sci-fi origin, but they probably went too far in that direction. So I don't know, it's a delicate balance. And I want to throw one more in there too. And that's, I said Doctor Who before, but and further examination, I think, Doctor Who is definitely, you can call it sci-fi, but I think there's so many things, so many elements of that story that it's almost underserving it to label it that way. You've got everything from Victorian murder mysteries to, comedic sort of, everything in between, the Roman Empire collapsing and just all these different things. It could be just as much a history show as anything else. I would say though, instead of that, or in place of that, the movie Contact, which I was watching before seeing The Martian, because a lot of people were like, "Ooh, this reminds me a lot of Contact," and I was like, "Really?" So I wanted to just rewatch that to get a sense of that, and it's more sci-fi drama, because it's a well-made movie. I mean, Robert Zemeckis made that movie and made it well, but it's definitely, I mean, if that's not sci-fi, I don't know what is. It's a long, slow build. And in fact, in watching it, and I've used to watch it once a year, and I've sort of since died down just because I know I could recite it to you by heart. But watching it in this sort of new context in the last week, it's hitting me pretty heavily. That whole movie could easily be a really great trade paperback, start to finish. And I can even see where you would divvy up the cuts or the breaks, if you're going to do issues first, like just everything about it, the way they revealed John Hurt's character, what she goes through. It's just, it really, I think it really works in that context. That's probably why I like it so much, or why I gravitate towards those kind of comics, where it's just, the story sort of sits very nicely in that space.
And then I believe, I don't know if it was offline or in our conversation on the podcast or when we were offline, that you were saying Contact is probably like a really good example of hard sci-fi. Is that? I think it because it's based on scientific. Well, it's based on the work of Carl Sagan, for God's sake.
Yeah, they even say they dedicate it to him. So it's like that element, that aspect is heavily baked throughout. There's they really go out of their way to make it real, feel real. Like they have everything from craftily edited clips of Bill Clinton, in other press conferences, making it look like he's talking about the events of the movie. Down to how are they going to pay how are they going to pay for this giant machine they have to build, to the fact that they built spoilers, they built two machines, one of my absolute, I get chills every time just thinking about it, is that towards the end, and if you haven't seen Contact at this point, you know, what are you waiting for?
I have not.
Well, you then. I don't want to spoil it for you because it's such a good.
Oh no! Sorry, I just cut your
No.
legs off.
It's there's a scene towards the end that just gives me chills every time, and it's something it's very realistic. You're like, oh, this is how this would happen.
Yeah.
And so like I think that again and there's a lot of social commentary, a lot of societal sort of commentary going on. I think that's that other side of sci-fi is where that comes into play, and you're not going to get that as deliberately in other genres, in fantasy, in horror, those things aren't, I keep going back to, I think that one of the central tenets of sci-fi, when people really get uppity about it, is when it does or doesn't have that social or societal commentary or critique baked into it.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I have argued before that's the purpose of science fiction, is sort of taking our current circumstances and changing some aspect and then analyzing it. Like, what is this going to show us about our current circumstances if we imagine, whatever this changes? And
as a heavy-handed segue, I think that's where the movie Elysium, if you talk about District 9, same
right.
director did Elysium. That's where Elysium fell down, is because it was too deliberately. It wasn't like District 9 was a great. It wasn't saying, it was represented apartheid and all of that stuff very, very well. It didn't say the alien, it wasn't, you just inferred that. So if you were completely oblivious to the way the world is and you went in and saw that movie, you think it was a great movie. But if you have an inkling of how, Africa has worked and how South Africa has worked in the last, 30 to 40 years, and, who Mandela even is, like, all of that is very much on display. And I think with Elysium, it was much more heavy handed. There's classism, it's the haves and have nots. And the movie ends where the have nots get to have the technology of the haves. And I just felt like that was less commentary and more like, we're going to use this lens to tell the story, but it didn't really give a viable solution to how we should address that today in the here and now. I think that's kind of where, so you walk out of there feeling less fulfilled because of it versus District 9. Right.
And another heavy-handed segue, we can go from one Matt Damon movie to the one we're discussing this week, which is The Martian.
Yes.
And even before we saw this, we kind of wondered, is it really science fiction? What is it? And I don't know where I come down on that. It's to me, it was just like seeing Apollo 13.
Yeah.
On Mars. And I almost proposed to you that we do this entire podcast and treat it like as a prank, as though this were a real story, because I know that's been a thing that's gone around social media, that some people actually think this is a true story being retold.
Really?
Yeah, I believe those are the comments I've read.
Wow. It does a very good job of, sort of, I don't know if there's a term to describe it, but just sort of like the future history as it were. I mean, even down to the point where some of the viral marketing includes, there was a video posted of like Neil deGrasse Tyson in 20 years from now, and they aged him up. They gave him gray hair and some wrinkles, but it's him basically doing what the version of Cosmos exists, or just internet media in the the 2030s. Him introducing the crew that's going to go on this mission and talking about the mission as though it was an actual produced video from NASA. So like all the tie-in media and everything like felt like this did this happen? Are we getting this sent back from the future? Like this is a real thing. So give credit to Ridley Scott for really nailing that part of it. I don't think though, and again, if we're making social commentary a direct tenet of what sci-fi is, this didn't really have that. Like this could have easily been a story about how early colonists come to America and leave Matt Damon in the wilderness of America by himself, and then go back, and then the monarchy is like, we got to go get him back. Like that, it could have easily been that story.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was gonna say, or like a little bit more contemporary. Like you got like people going across the Oregon Trail, and like they accidentally leave Matt Damon behind to survive with a hatchet or something. Like and I would even say too, the book The Hatchet, which I read when I was a kid, more than anything, this reminded me of that, because the hatchet is very much about, I have only these many things. I've got my ingenuity and my intelligence, and I got to make the best out of it. And it wasn't so much, it wasn't so much about, will he survive? I take that. It wasn't so much about the desperation of surviving, which I think is what Castaway really nails well. Castaway is about, one dude just trying to hold it together mentally.
Right.
And just trying to deal and trying to understand, like, and everything from like the suicide attempt and all that stuff in Castaway. And he talks to a ball, for God's sake. Whereas the thing I loved about The Martian was just right off the bat, he had like a night where he's like, he cursed at Mars and cursed at himself and just was pissed off at the situation for a night. And the next morning he's like, he starts those video diaries and he's like, we're going to get to business. We're going to get to work right now. Here we go. And I really like that. It was like, okay, cool. Finally, here's a movie that's less about, oh no, he's been lost behind, and more about how's he going to deal with this for the next 6 months to 12 months to whatever.
I saw this headline. There was a critique of the movie so I didn't read the article because the headline turned me off so much, which was like, where The Martian fails is on its, it's got no backstory and there's no sense of the characters in it and whatever. And I was like, I think you missed the point entirely, man.
Oh God, yeah. Who's saying that?
I know. I mean, it was some major paper. And it was, to me, it was exactly what you talk about, where there's like that night of, the night he realizes what happened and what, why it transpired that he was left behind, and presumed dead. He has a terrible night, and he has many more after that, but it's just not really shown. But at that point, it becomes about solving the problems and, figuring out, how am I going to eat? How much food is left here? How can I communicate? How can I travel? Like he really has to, fix that thing, which is the Apollo 13 aspect of it, which is, that, Apollo 13 has just got to be one of my all-time favorite movies, where that, problem-solving ability was it's just so cool. You almost don't care that Watney, Matt Damon's character in The Martian. Like, I don't care what his life is back on Earth. Like, that is immaterial to him.
Yeah, well,
trying
it's
to survive.
Thanks for bringing that up, because that was the other thing I really liked about it. There wasn't like these, heartbreaking scenes of his wife, video conferencing him and all these things that these tropes you would normally find in other movies. It happened in Apollo 13 too, but the only thing we got out of it was him talking to, without trying to spoil too much, like him talking to another member of the cast, basically saying, hey, my parents are back home. If this doesn't work out for me, I want you to go tell them my story. And I was like, and that was all I needed, just to know, because you wanted to know he had some connection back to Earth. You had to humanize it a little bit, but it didn't have to throw it in your face, and him like having some longing, tear felt like, oh God, I'm going to see you soon, honey. Like, and that's the movie. That wasn't the point of it. I'm so glad they weren't tempted to go down that road.
Well, and to extend that Apollo 13 comparison, there's so many shots in that movie of the family in front of the TV, like all holding hands, and they're all crying. And in those moments, you're seeing this like with them. You're like, oh my God, like what was it like on that couch where there's, 10 minutes of radio silence or whatever until they, while they pass through the atmosphere, and you're feeling with the family. But in The Martian, you're with him on the planet alone. It's like the scene, it would have taken me out of that moment if I had to see like the girlfriend, moving on with her life or whatever. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was one of the interesting things about Castaway was none of that was hinted at either until the end of the movie, when they sort of showed what had happened to the woman he was his wife or his girlfriend. You kind of catch up on the story that way. But but it does this awesome job of while at the same time not making you feel agoraphobic or claustrophobic, because you're stuck with him on the planet, because it does cut back to NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory trying to solve these problems. Mm-hmm. And honestly, like I'll back up one more second and say, last week when we talked about the sci-fi, you asked me if I was going to see The Martian. I was like, nah, I don't care. And now I can just sense in my voice, like I'm so excited about this movie. It was a real, I don't think I knew the hook getting into it. I think I thought like, oh man, I don't don't want to see Castaway on Mars, or I don't want to see Red Planet again, or Mission to Mars, or something like that. But it was so much more thrilling because of that like hard science that's in it,
Well, they did a really good job. And granted, keep in mind, this was based on a book, a very much beloved book. And I'm going to guess the movie was as good as it was because it was so loyal to the book. The one thing I don't know, and I need to find somebody who's read the book to verify this, is do we ever see the point of view of NASA, of the other crew, etc., like we do in the movie? Or is it just his POV from start to finish? And only when he interacts with those other parts do we see what they're saying? Because I could see that working very well in the context of a book.
Right.
I'm glad in the movie they went the way they did. It absolutely was necessary. Otherwise, it'd be too much like Castaway, I think. And a lot of these problems, like you needed to see the Jet Propulsion Lab. You needed to see these other people trying to figure this out and dealing themselves with Jeff Daniels had a lot of crap thrown at him, and he had to navigate that the best way he could.
Yeah. Well, that's such a great point that I put in our notes. Like even for all the crap I would shovel onto bureaucracy, like, and I don't want to watch it, like for example, the movie The Terminal with Tom Hanks drives me up.
Oh yeah,
man, that is just like, I've been to the DMV. I don't need to see another person being put through a bureaucratic runaround, and trapped. But I loved seeing the bureaucracy of NASA in this movie, and Jeff Daniels, and then all these other shocking cast members I didn't know about. Kristen Wiig being the public relations director of NASA, and seeing them have to figure out, like, let's think about the outcome of this decision and how that's going to play. And we've got funding to think about. And we've got the next mission, and we've got, it almost could have been played as like the heartless bureaucrat. But instead it's portrayed as like the stoic bureaucrats who have real shitstorms to deal with, and they're just biting their lips until they get through it. Like they can't let on. There's that one moment, which we don't have to spoil, but where Jeff Daniels shows some emotion. He goes, yes, and it's like, that's all you get out of him. You can tell he's been so tense about everything. And this 1 second, he's there in the moment, like being excited. And well, and then shot casting. I didn't realize Sean Bean and Donald Glover were in this thing. Like when Sean Bean wasn't dead on Mars. If he had been the Martian, they would have just left him there, right?
Yeah.
The way to go.
Yeah. Well, I was surprised too. Honestly, that as it was going, I'm surprised he wasn't like already in some other, like Matt Damon's like, there's another base up here. There's another guy who's been here for 8 months. Like I'm going to go to, and it's Sean Bean. Of course, Sean Bean has to sacrifice himself for Matt Damon to live. Like that's how it would, 10 years ago, that's where we would be right now. Like, I know what we need. Let's have another outpost that he goes to. And there's another guy like lost in the hatch that he has to break into. And that guy's been there forever. And Sean Bean. Let me ask you that.
He was shocking. It was just, I loved seeing that. And Donald Glover. Oh, Donald Glover was so good in it. And, when they first wake him up in that scene and call his name, and I was like, is that Donald Glover?
Yeah, I had the same thing. I was like, is that who? Well, and then Chiwetel Ejiofor, like that dude just continues to impress me. Like, and I had to remind myself that's who that was. Because when he popped up at first, I'm like, who is that? I know him. And then I was like, oh, that's right. I knew he was in it. I just didn't realize that. I need to refamiliarize myself with what he looks like, because every movie he's in, he sort of does a different character. Yeah. It always throws me. He's kind of like the African American, Commissioner Gordon. What the hell is his name? Just Gary Oldman. And that he sort of has this ability to just sort of, he doesn't change his physical appearance a lot, but just the way he presents himself in the character just makes it a whole different dude. And it's a magic trick. I don't know how he does it.
Yeah. And I loved Bryce Dallas Howard in it. She was a great character.
Who's that? Sorry. Bryce Dallas Howard. Yeah.
Yeah. As Jessica.
No, Chastain. Jessica Chastain. Yeah. As Jessica Chastain. Yeah. Well, and it says a lot that for the first 10 minutes of the movie, all I kept I had to really struggle and try to not sing that song, that I am not Jessica Chastain. That's that song that they do. Like it was a lot for me to not just sing that in my head the entire time, because it's every time either of them pop up on screen, I'm like, oh, here we go. Like, in fact, I had that same problem. What was the movie you recommended to me? The spy movie with her in it. The Debt. Yeah. Same thing there. Like half that movie, I'm just like, I am not Jessica Chastain. Just the whole thing. So
I didn't actually realize it was Jessica Chastain until the end. I have no idea what Like, I'm like face blindness or something to both of them for whatever reason.
The cast was definitely a nice, pleasant surprise and worked really well and was really diverse when you think about it. Like the crew, it was a very well balanced cast all around.
Oh yeah.
And then even you could tell that the Chinese anymore to get a major movie like this made, you pretty much have to get foreign money and usually Chinese money is involved. And I love the sort of ways they try to work that into the story. Where, like at one point they go to the Chinese version of NASA, they reach out to them for something. And like, as soon as it hit, I was like, oh, this is where the Chinese money's going. Cause they always have to try to represent, for them to market it in China and have all that, they kind of want that, that element and then just that co-financing. But in this case, it worked. It served the story really well. Like I could see in 20 years, like that's exactly what would happen.
So
they would have.
You're saying that the movie was, partially produced with Chinese money, and that was sort of the payoff of it, was that they would put the Chinese Space Agency in it?
Oh, dude, a lot of movies are that way. There was a whole version of Iron Man 3 that you've never seen that has Chinese actors in it. Because they got a lot of that co-financing was from Chinese companies. And so like, there's a whole, and I've been trying to find it. They haven't put it out in America, but there's like a whole, it's still Iron Man 3 with a lot of the same stuff, but there's like all these other scenes and takes and characters that are Chinese based that you've never seen before. And that was the movie, that was the version of the movie that they got over there. So that's like it's more and more kind of a movie of this size and budget. That's usually what's going to happen. Another great point, Looper, the Rian Johnson movie with, you've seen it, I'm assuming.
No,
you haven't. Okay. So there's a scene there originally in the script in Looper, Joe Gordon-Levitt's character, he's talking about saving up his money, doing his mafia job, and he's saving up. He's going to go to France, and that was like the movie was going to then show him in France. Because of the Chinese co-production money, they moved it to Shanghai, and so they even said it's funny. They kept the script the same. He's like, I'm going to go to France, and then Jeff Daniels' character is like, go to China, son. He's like, yeah, but I'm really like France. He's like, I'm from the future. I'm telling you, go to China. So instead, they shoot all those scenes in China instead. I mean, it's not a lot of stuff, but it's just a nice little. I think they did that because they were getting that co-production money.
That's funny.
That's usually sort of a caveat, is we want you to showcase the country or have Chinese actors or inject that in some way. It's not always required, but it's usually kind of when they're structuring those deals, it's usually something that comes out.
That's really funny to think about. Well, I went to the Wikipedia page for the novel, and it, as far as I can tell in my quick glance, it looks like the China National Space Agency is actually in the novel. So maybe it just worked out that way. But I'll tell you what's really interesting is that this like third sentence of the Wikipedia description is the novel is described as Hatchet in space. So you nailed it. I've never heard of Hatchet.
That Wikipedia entry. You haven't read? Oh God! So the Hatchet is one of those, like, it wasn't required reading for me, but it should have been in middle school. It's just so great because it's about a young kid essentially. I think he's like his early teens, maybe mid-teens, who gets trapped in the Alaska wilderness, or lost rather in the Alaska wilderness with a hatchet, and that's it. And he has to science his way out of that. That too. Speaking of that, was there any part of The Martian for you that seemed too, like, where he seemed too able? He was too capable of where you're just like, really, he knows that too? Like, did any of that surprise you? Did it seem like someone of his intelligence could have logically figured all the stuff that he figured out by himself?
I really thought they did. It's difficult to balance that because there were some parts where, not that it was too detailed, but where they went, the description when he starts to, grow crops, there was a lengthy description of how to produce water in that environment, and, so you kind of think, oh God, I hope he doesn't explain everything in those details, So I think they just had to do a couple of those. So you kind of buy into, well, he could be, giving us the microscience of everything that he's doing, but we're just going to kind of accept that he did. Anyway, my point being, I think they did a great balance of like, showing him thinking through the problems and describing them, and then just sometimes just doing them,
Yeah.
Because sometimes movies are way too in the, microscopic version of everything. And, sometimes they're way too macro and you just don't believe that they know all that stuff. And I just liked it where it looked like this is a really, really well prepared astronaut. I mean, that is what we trust our astronauts to be. They're scientists of different backgrounds, and then they've had this huge schooling in the science of space and all the equipment that NASA uses and stuff. And I'll tell you one of the things I really liked about it was, which had such a callback to Apollo 13, was in Apollo 13, they, I can't remember what they do. They go stay in the LEM or something like that, or vice versa.
Yeah.
They get out of the LEM or something and they have to filter the air back. And so the NASA is relaying the hack that they've done to change this air filter. And they say, well, the LEM crew used metric measurements and we used English measurements or something like that, or it's like a square hole and a round peg kind of thing. And it's just one of those classic, like, two teams worked on this and they didn't use the same standards. And now we've got to, hack it together to make it work. And there's a moment in that where the guy from JPL says something like, well, there's going to be a problem with the, with the rocket, it was, it was meant to have all these people on it and they're going to weigh this much. And it was like, I know that's a real problem just from that, that's like such a callback to what the Apollo 13 problems that they had, like literally nobody thought it would be used for this. So
there's more I want to get into on that, but we're going to do a spoilers sort of section here in a second. Dive, because I have some other questions. Before we do, though, for the listener who hasn't yet seen this, you saw it in 3D, correct?
I did. Yeah.
I saw it in 2D. Just the option wasn't given to me. How was the 3D? How was the experience?
I loved it. It was, it's definitely not like an action movie where, I wouldn't be surprised that it was retrofitted into 3D.
Okay.
But it wasn't like I know Pacific Rim, for example, was retrofitted into 3D because initially they said, we don't have the money for you to shoot it in 3D. So he shot it in 2D and then they have to do all this, like, computer animation to fit it in 3D because they thought it would be so good that way. And so there's often in those kind of movies, there's sort of a deliberate, jutting of things out to show you the depth of field and stuff like that. Or there's the reverse where they've shot it with a shallow depth of field and something's out of focus in the background. And like if you're actually seeing it in 3D, that would probably be in focus. And it's like, you're like, your brain is sort of taking in maybe more movement in those than it needs to. But in this, it's just so subtle because it's those great big, huge landscape shots you just really feel this depth. And especially because it's communicating like he's the only guy on a planet,
Yeah.
And to see that vast desert with nothing but like this little, rover going across it is really,
that's
impactful.
Why though, that's a great point too. Cause that's why I think we talked about it not feeling claustrophobic. I think that was the other secret weapon of this movie is that they shot Mars like it's an actual location that, you and I could just drive, 50 miles down the road to a national park somewhere. Yeah. I'm sure and they filmed it, in a desert in the real world. Then they added on
and then colored
additional stuff.
Something.
Yeah. But it's like they shot it. It wasn't like any of those other Mars movies you mentioned where it's like, they just blowing dust everywhere and just crazy. Right. It was like, no, this is an actual place. I mean, Mars exists just like that. It's an actual place that has topography, just, not dissimilar from us. It's just not oxygen.
And has weather, like the weather elements were so realistic and well done.
Yeah. And there was a scene too, but like, at one point in the movie, he says, I loved this, as he's in the rover, he's like, everywhere I go, I'm the first. I'm the first person to walk on this cliff. I'm the first person to see this. I'm the first person to do. And I'm just like, that really resonated with me because I'm like, that's exactly if I was in his position, that's how I would perceive it. It's like, oh my God, everything I do is I'm the first person to do it. I'm the first person to be alone on a planet. And like that, that's an incredible, you feel that, but then you also feel sort of the excitement of just that possibility. Like he's all alone on a planet. It's like, holy crap. Like that's insane to think about. Like, and they, you've got these sweeping vistas and stuff to kind of drive that point home.
It looked so clean in 3D. My the thing that bummed me out the most was at least around me in Nashville right now, is that I don't see it playing anywhere in IMAX. And whether it were 3D or 2D, I want to see this in IMAX.
Yeah, IMAX would be cool. There's a lot of shots, specifically spoilery kinds of shots. I don't want to talk too much about it just yet, that I think would be gorgeous in IMAX.
Yeah. So what was the 2D experience? I mean, were you as impressed with it? Just
it was just. I mean, it was solid, and I think the 2D worked just fine because a lot of the shots are him talking to the video journal. So there's like security cam style footage that's not like high def film stock. It's just like a webcam. So it's like in that regard, like a lot of that, it looked cool seeing it on the big screen. But I can see this being a movie that works just as well, on a flat screen and in your living room when it comes out on. It's great seeing it on the big screen, but I love the fact that I could be just as satisfied watching this on a small screen, and have that, because there's a lot of intimate moments in this, just like Moon, the movie Moon. There's a lot of intimate moments that I think work really well on a small screen. And I like that they're thinking, especially somebody like Ridley Scott, who's so used to going big, every time, big production values, big, huge space and everything. And you've got that here, but he balanced it very well with small, focused, intimate kinds of stuff. And that's gutsy for a guy like him to go that way at this point in his career.
Yeah. And oh man, I'm just thinking of that. You're right. Like that it does not feel claustrophobic. And when you think of the legacy of Ridley Scott, like Prometheus feels really claustrophobic. I mean, even when they're on the planet and the storm hits, or when they're down in the cave, it's like, it feels really close. You know?
Yeah.
And that one, I'm pretty sure I saw that in 3D as well. And I definitely didn't feel that like wide open space and vista kind of feel. It felt like,
you're right. I misspoke. I misspoke. Well, I was thinking like but even like Blade Runner, it's got huge production value, but it's very claustrophobic. Alien, they're in a spaceship. Yeah. It's like a ghost. It's a haunted house as a spaceship. Like it is very much. That's the kind of movie he tends to make. So that's
I wasn't trying to contradict you. I think you're
you're right though. I was
right though.
I wanted
they are big production, but they're where you can I mean, it's not that you can tell it's a set, but it's on a set or something. I think The Martian does such a great job of showing it as more like, realistic. It's just we there's nothing in that movie that I felt like that doesn't exist today.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to should we put the spoiler blinds up and
get
a little bit more detail?
So we're going to do some spoilers. So if you have seen the movie and want to stick around and listen to us talk about things that happen in the movie, stay tuned. If you've not seen the movie, feel free to tune out now and come back when you've seen it. And in the meantime, you can find me on Twitter at HeyToddA, and you can find Taylor on Twitter at Taylor Trask, and you can find both of us at toddandtaylor.com. So
that's right.
Is that enough of a warning? We're going into spoilers.
I think so. Yeah. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, stop right now and then come back after you have, because let's even do a countdown. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay.
Get out. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. The door is shut. If you're in here, you don't care. You've seen the movie. So
Jon Snow is dead.
Jon Snow is walking around Ireland. He's staying in the hotel. He's still there, man.
I do think he's pulling the prank you described, which is just being like Sean Bean and showing up on the sets. I think that's what Kit Harington is doing now.
Let me throw so on that note, because one of the sort of wonderfully meta moments of this thing was when they're sitting around the table later on in the movie. So they've decided they have a plan for how they're going to save Mark Watney. Mark. They're going to save Mark, and they're sitting around the table. And by this point, Donald Glover's character has joined, and they're like, Project Elrond. What does that mean? And I kid you not, as it panned around the table, like Sean Bean was literally just sitting there, and like I'm like, how hard was it him for not to either crack a smile or roll his eyes or something when they're like, you know what we're going to do right now? This is the scene where they talk about Lord of the Rings and the Council of Elrond, which his character was clearly in. Yeah, and it was such a beautifully. Like he didn't say anything. Like they didn't and I give them a lot of credit for not, I'm sure they were tempted to be like, well, let's have Sean, let's quick little cut, 2-second cutaway of Sean just sort of, chuckling to himself or something. And they didn't do that. they showed him just kind of, he was sitting around the table, but it was, I think everybody in the theater was like, One does not simply use the gravity of the earth to launch the spaceship.
Yeah.
It was wonderfully meta. I love that. And there was a couple moments like that too. Like there was another one where there was a lot. This movie was funnier than I thought it would be. Like there was a lot of humor baked in. And it wasn't just like, sometimes with these tragedy movies or these sort of this style of drama, it's like, they'll go 20, 30 minutes before dropping in a moment of levity just so that it's not, you can at least catch your breath a little bit. And this was almost, I would say this was more 60-40 funny versus, serious. There's a lot of serious moments, but there's so much comedy. Like even when, after the Chinese get involved and then the director of the Jet Propulsion Lab comes in, he's like, my Uncle Teddy from China just saved our ass. And it's just like, just casually throwing that out there was so...
And I mean, I know I'm just a broken record at this point, but so much of that was, it's totally cool that they did this. It is of the style of Apollo 13. I mean, it's like, you get the sense that like, this is how these scientists and astronauts have to break the tension.
Yeah.
You have to have Mark Watney saying like, well, this is what you get for leaving me for dead on Mars, like just that black humor of that. And, and the JPL guy walking in and saying that about his Uncle Ted. I mean, it's like, this stuff is tense and these guys have to crack a joke like that, and I remember similar moments in Apollo 13 and to me, it actually made The Martian stronger that it played with that same tone instead of going for like the tone of a disaster flick or an action movie where it's, a little bit more over the top or something. I mean, even, when Jeff Daniels tells Rich, Donald Glover's character, to just get out of the room, I mean, it's still not, played like, the captain telling Axel Foley to get out of the Beverly Hills police station. It's still not like overplayed or something. It's just, it's like on tone and just Rich, get out.
There wasn't this like, in other movies, Donald Glover's character would after that moment become like the new sort of flight director. Like he'd be eerily promoted. And it was like, no, he just goes back to his regular job. And and the other thing that I really like too is, once we got to the ending and it's been revealed that they do make it back. I love the way they do the credits at the end, where they're showing you a whole scene while giving as it flashes on. They found a way to incorporate every primary actor into like this kind of this capstone scene and show you who they are. But then they also like, Sean Bean's character at one point helps the, he sends the instructions to the Ares 4 to go back.
Hermes, right?
Hermes 4. Yeah, Hermes. There we go. Hermes to like go back and get in. This is, Jeff Daniels and NASA didn't want to do that. They wanted to bring them back home safely and send supplies to Mark a different way.
Right.
So, Sean Bean's character gets in trouble for that. And then Jeff Daniels clearly says, I want your resignation after this is over. Again, in any other movie, after everyone's back home, he'd still be, it's like, oh, I've changed my mind. Everybody's fine. No, he gets fired. Like they show him golfing, when the next Ares mission's going, they end showing you the launch of the next Ares mission.
Yeah.
And as they're doing that, here's everybody who was involved in the movie. Here's where they are while that process is happening. And they show Sean Bean just on the golf course. He's not involved. You just assume that's what, he resigned and he's doing this now. And he's not dead. So there's that.
Yeah. And I have that tiniest of griefs, which is I just didn't like, the scene of Matt Damon or Mark Watney as the NASA instructor. And it's so stupid. And I loved the message of that scene where he really just lays out the message of the movie, which is that you just got to science the shit out of everything. You got to solve one problem and solve the next. And once you solve enough problems, you get home. And it's like, that's like, that was such a great wrap right there. But for whatever reason, I just didn't, the moment, the cut, and maybe it was a length thing or something, but it's like, they're picking him up in outer space in this harrowing rescue, and then cut to him on a bench on Earth. And it was I love the moment where he touches the leaves of the plant that are growing through the sidewalk at his feet. That was great, but just that jump was so abrupt.
I had
a
big problem with that too, and I looked at my girlfriend at the time who's watching with me, and I'm like, are we expected to believe? Because think about this. So they have to basically shut down half of the Hermes to rescue him, right?
Yeah.
And then still another 6 to 8 months of them having to get back to Earth. Are we expected to believe that nothing went wrong during that time too? Like,
I know.
It was just completely smooth sailing in half a spaceship for 6 months. Like, how really? And it seems so like they set that up. And now if the ship had remained, if they hadn't, blown the hatch in the way they did and the ship remained intact, I would have bought it a lot more. But just the fact that happened, and then they used up a lot of their fuel to try to maneuver to get him. I'm like, there's a lot of other shit that could have happened that I don't want to just assume went okay, and it's like, what else? And I see why, because the whole point is, is he safe? But they made a big deal about, is the crew going to be safe? And then I don't know, they could have stretched it another 10 to 15 minutes. I don't know what you would have done story-wise or script-wise to bridge that gap. It would have been really hard.
Right.
Because once you save him, you want to get out of the movie quickly. You want to basically be like, hey, everyone's fine, and here's... So I get it, but I agree with you. It was very abrupt. It was very like, oh, okay.
And, it's like, it's Monday morning quarterbacking. It's like we could dream up all these other ways to present the information that Matt Damon says in that in the NASA training class. Yeah. Like, is it a voiceover while we see them floating through space and doing more? But I mean, there were definitely a few questions I would have liked to have seen answered. He was clearly, his body was deteriorating when they picked him up.
And his ribs were broken. Like he said, my ribs are broken. Like, I'm like, Jesus.
It's just like, just give me, like you said, like 5-10 minutes of the aftermath of that. Like, what is the plan to get back to Earth with half this spacecraft dead? Not, and the people aren't dead, obviously, but just the,
I'll tell you what would have worked for me. Like, if they're like, okay, fine, what would you come in our test screening and whatever you want, we'll do. Knowing that, I would have said, all I really needed is after they sort of embrace, after they pull him in and then, he takes off the helmet, they all embrace each other. Have just one more sort of quiet scene where he's sitting there on like a bench or at the table inside talking to Jessica Chastain or talking to one of the other characters. Mm-hmm. And, he's just basically like sort of silently reflecting on everything he's been through and just sort of taking a breath of like, I made it, and then they just have it could be like, 2 to 5 minutes. And they're just like, the Jessica Chastain could go, we had to blow up, we had to scrap half the ship to do this. And he's like, oh, are we going to, and there could have been a joke tied in there too. Like, well, how are we going to, we're going to all have to be in the, small quarters for 6 months and something where it's just like, okay, they're acknowledging that this is not necessarily, they're not out of the woods yet, but we can assume after that acknowledgement, it will be fine from that point on, instead of just the movie acknowledging that itself. Cause it acknowledged so much else. There's so many other things that it was intentional to go, we're going to show you this and we're not going to assume that you understand that this is resolved yet. And this is going to happen. And this is, all of those things. Even like his journey across Mars to the other, what do you call it? The other landing site.
Right.
Like, they showed you that entire journey. They could have easily just cut, he made it, but they showed you every step of the way. Like, oh, he's got to recharge the rover and here's what's going to happen. And it could still go wrong. And so you just sort of like the whole time thinking, oh my God, like there's a whole, half hour left of these guys getting back to Earth that we should probably at least be aware of. But again, it's hard. Like I'm sure these conversations came up and I'm sure this was just like the best way they could do it with the budget and the time they had allowed. So,
right. Yeah, I do. And I do like what you said about the credit scenes being like the capstones on like everyone's individual story. And I really like that. And so, I don't know, maybe the classroom scene should have been in there somewhere or something like that. And then it's more part of the wrap up than the third act. But it just felt like a really abbreviated, third act or fifth act or whatever it was to have him walking the grounds at NASA and going to the teacher class. Like, how the hell did they get through all these other obstacles here?
Yeah. Were you as surprised as I was to see Martinez back? He just joined the next, like all of them are like, we're staying put, but he's like, he jumps back in on the next mission.
Yeah.
They show him right away. I was like, oh my God, he's hardcore.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was he not the character that said, 900 days in space is enough for a lifetime? Or was that one of the other guys?
Oh, God, I think it was him. It seems like something he said. It was either him or Sebastian Stan. It was one of those two guys.
I think you're right. I think it might have been Sebastian Stan. Because it comes up when Lewis mentions that they could be court-martialed because they're military officers,
Yeah.
That they, if they do this, if they enact this plan without NASA's permission, what happens? And I don't know. It's just, man, there's so many good details in it. Yeah. So why that truncated ending? But that said, I think that is just such a nitpicky thing, because it was so exhausting watching him get rescued in those last moments that I didn't want to see more emergencies after that.
Yeah, well, that's true.
As an audience member, I was like, that would have been,
like what else could go wrong?
Yeah,
well, part of me too had a flashback. I mean, the scene where he's getting all tangled up in the thing. Did you not instantly have a flashback to Gravity? I mean, it was almost a shot for shot remake. I'm just like, holy crap, this is like, and we learned from Gravity that's where everything starts going wrong. I was just
my God. I was so happy that the movie didn't go to those places and make it more of a disaster than it already was. And that was part of that, like how well it was done. Like there was enough tension in that scene that nobody needed to break off and float away into space or something. It was like, no, I when they were setting the bomb to blow the back of the craft off, or the front of the craft, or however they did it, I was so afraid, like, oh, this guy's going to get blown up, and that's going to be the.
Oh, I thought it was going to be Lewis, because.
Oh yeah, I thought she was just going to float away.
Where she's like, this is my call. You guys don't have anything to say about it. I'm like, oh man, this is like traditional, like leader sacrificing themselself sort of language here. And as soon as she tried to catch him, I was like, oh shit, she's gonna. And there was sort of a subtext going the whole time of her guilt for leaving him behind.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, maybe that's sort of where this is headed, where she sacrifices himself for him. And it's, because the whole time you're like, he's got to survive. Like the whole movie can't be all this shit happens to him and he dies. Like that would be, no one wants to see that. So he's got to survive. So you're like, if that's the case, then somebody else might have to die. Who's it going to be? And I'm glad they didn't go that way. Like, to your point, like I'm glad they're like, they push the tension to the absolute last minute, and they're like, okay, and now we're good, and here's everybody back on Earth, and we're good, and even little things like Kate Mara's character and Sebastian Stan, like they have a kid together, and it's like they don't beat you over the head with it. They're just like, oh, and by the way, this happened and this happened, and like little things that they hinted at, or like they kind of follow through at the very end of that little tag. So
it was amazingly well done. I mean, I wish I had a more intelligent cap to our own podcast, but it was just, I loved every minute of it. It was great.
Yeah, I agree. I can't wait to see it on DVD when it comes out again, or just on VOD, I should say, at this point when it comes out again.
And now I've definitely got to see Contact. I know that was part of my.
Oh God, dude, you've got to. It's not the same movie at all, but it's got a lot of the same realism that you liked about The Martian. It's prevalent in like you see the bureaucracy of how this would have actually. Yeah. In fact, more than anything, you see the bureaucracy of how, one woman's sort of vision could be co-opted by all these different people, and like how the world would, unite around this cause, but there'd still be all these hiccups and like what threats actually exist. It's so realistic in that sense. That's one of the reasons I go back to it all these times. But there's this, as it gets closer and closer to the end, I mean, it gets a little bit more fantastical as it gets closer to the end, but there's, I don't know, it stays. And then it stays, I think the ending of Contact is probably its strongest part, because it doesn't just end with, she goes into space and hooray. It ends with like a government inquiry.
Right.
And that's not a spoiler. It ends with this whole like inquiry that, it's not like it's not like a warm fuzzy kind of feeling. I mean, it kind of is, but it's very much like this is what would happen in the real world. Like this, they would put her through this too, So I don't know. There's a lot to digest there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we could put a pin in that right now.
Yeah. On that note.
Yeah.
Go see. Well, if you've listened this far, hopefully you've seen The Martian. It's so good. I'm super happy that it went, despite my ambivalence earlier.
Yeah, man. Well, now we got next coming up. We've not in terms of podcasts, but in terms of movies, we got Steve Jobs, we got Spectre, we got Hunger Games, we got Star Wars. We got like this is gonna be it's kind of the beginning of a busy fall movie season.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm excited for it. So, anyway, I think let's just sign off. I guess
that sounds good. If you missed it before, we're at toddandtaylor.com. I'm at Hey Todd A. He is at Taylor Trask on Twitter, that is. And go to toddandtaylor.com and check out some of our other episodes if you haven't.
Yeah, so. check out stuff and let us know what you think, and we'll see you guys next time.
Later.